So when I was a kid, I was pretty shy. I didn't really play any sports. I had a few good friends, but I wasn't what you would call popular, and I got bullied a fair bit. But somewhere in all that, I got into a game, or like a few games, that changed how I thought about learning and getting outside of my comfort zone and my own ability to get good at stuff. And honestly, I think that changed my life. So today I'm going to talk about what I learned from fighting games. And even if you don't know what the Daigo parry is and you've never worried about King's throw chart, I'm hoping you'll find something in here that will make you better at the things that you do care about. And by the end, I'm hoping you'll understand why playing fighting games helped me to have some fights in real life, get my black belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and even learn to play the piano. Before I get into all that though, I think the first thing you have to understand about fighting games is that they're pretty much totally different from every other sort of game. Most games exist to make you feel good about yourself. They take something that looks cool and difficult, like fighting a giant electric camel, and then they simplify it down until you can do it without thinking about it too much. They're quite often designed to get you into a flow state where everything feels effortless and fun, and even in multiplayer mode, you never need to know more than a few things to feel like you're a total badass. Fighting games though are basically the total opposite of that. There's a ton to learn in them before you can even start to think about doing anything really cool. And when I was coming up, there was no sort of training mode to help you learn any of it. In multiplayer, which is where the fun is, the other player's objective is to basically knock you out of the flow state and keep you as frustrated as possible without letting you do anything at all. So why do people even play fighting games? Well, everyone has their own reasons. But for me, as a slightly awkward kid, it was because I was obsessed with martial arts. My mum and dad were amazing and they loved me a lot, but they wouldn't let me do karate. I think they thought I might get hurt. So instead of that, I would sneak into the arcade in my town that even the tough kids from my school were scared to go in, and I would take on anybody who wanted to fight me in games like Street Fighter and Samurai Showdown. And that's what was amazing about Street Fighter back in the 90s. As Patrick Miller, who's a far better fighting game player than I am, points out, the core game content of Street Fighter matches up with the distribution model of arcade games. In the game, you're flying from country to country to take on the world's strongest fighters in like airports and Brazilian villages. And in real life, you could test yourself against all comers, basically anywhere that you could find an arcade machine. And so if you loved Street Fighter 2 like I did, then there was a really strong motivation to try and get good at it. And that's something that took a lot of time and effort. At first you just need to learn the controls and the buttons, and then the special moves for the characters you like and the characters you'll be fighting. And that's like the beginner stage where the gains come really fast, and you'll improve from session to session because you just go from having no idea what to do in most situations to having kind of a vague plan most of the time. But then the diminishing returns kick in, and at that point you've got a choice. You carry on being sort of okay, you give up playing altogether, or you start to be proactive about your own improvement. And that's when you start to pay attention to what everyone else is doing. You start to learn combos, and you start to learn what moves have priority over other ones, and then you get into what I think of as the grind. And this is a place that will be familiar to anyone who's tried really hard to get good at anything. There's a point where the learning curve starts to flatten out, and you stop making gains from session to session. Starting something new is kind of difficult, but the grind is the really hard bit, and I don't think anybody is born enjoying it. But you can learn to love it, and I think this is the first thing that fighting games taught me. You aren't going to go from being bad at a fighting game to good at it in just a couple of days. You aren't even going to get good with one character. But what you can do is start to break the biggest skill you want to learn down into smaller skills, and those you can learn in a couple of hours. So maybe you learn a couple of useful combos, and you go from not being able to do them at all to doing them pretty consistently. In most video games, grinding is about doing the same simple actions again and again to kind of gather resources or level up your character. In Street Fighter, there aren't any resources to gather, and you get access to the same character the world champions use straight out of the gate. So what grinding means in fighting games is learning small skills and practicing them a lot, and then finding other skills and practicing those too. So you just cannot get good at Street Fighter without learning to find satisfaction in the actual routine of practicing to get better over days or weeks or months or years. You have to enjoy the process of doing a sequence of movements right 10 times in a row or whatever, and that is a mindset that transfers perfectly to skills like playing the piano. You can't win every match, but you can make progress every time you train. And that is something Ryu would approve of. And it's the first part of learning to learn. So fighting games are incredibly complex. Even after you learn all the moves, you have to learn how they work together, which ones have priority over others, and which work in which situations. And then on top of all that, you're playing against another person, so you have to learn to read their playing style and even maybe their emotions, and do all that while they're doing their best to do the same to you. And then maybe one day you can do something like this. And so before I got good at Street Fighter, I never really had to teach myself anything. I read a lot of books, but that's reading books. I eventually got pretty good at juggling, but juggling's actually pretty simple. You're just throwing stuff and catching it again. And none of that stuff is fighting back, usually. So playing fighting games was the first time when I really had to learn how to learn, like watching other people do things and trying to break down what they were doing, or even asking them. It was also the first time that I realised that your brain learns stuff on its own, after you put in enough effort and time and then sleep on it until it all kind of clicks together. And the thing is, this is how everything else works too. You break down skills and practice the parts, and then you let your mind work on it in the background while you're doing other things. And when I started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I found something in it that's a lot like Street Fighter. The sparring is pretty much all out, and it's usually fairly clear who wins or loses each round. And you can pretty much go to any gym anywhere in the world and just test yourself against whoever you find there. It's also wildly complex, with different people developing radically different movesets, so it's impossible to learn everything. So there's a ton of incentive to learn all the skills and principles you can. And once you've learned how to learn something as complicated as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Street Fighter, you find that the process you've used is also applicable to just about any other skill you want to learn in the rest of your life. Nothing feels as intimidating once you've been through King's Throw chart in Tekken. And that brings us to leveling up in confidence. So John Danaher, who's pretty much universally regarded as the best Jiu-Jitsu coach on the planet, talks about the fact that confidence isn't something you can trick yourself into having. It's something that you build by putting in the work to get good at something.
People tend to see things like confidence as a mental state. It is. But it comes out of the performance of physical skills.
And that's certainly something that happened with me. Fighting games were one of the first areas where I realised that by putting in the work, I could get really good at something that felt impossible at first. But I think there's a little bit more to it than that. Most people don't compete much in their lives. So winning and losing and just trying really, really hard at things are like unfamiliar, awkward experiences. In the arcade where I started playing though, I was basically playing for money, because obviously if you lost you had to put another coin in the machine to try again, every single week. And if you do enough of that as a young, shy kid, beating grown adults who are doing their best to beat you, then you realise that putting in work at anything will pay off, that you can teach yourself new skills, and that you'll get better at basically anything you practice at. And so when I got older and I started practicing mixed martial arts, that's a lesson I took with me all the way into a cage. And don't get me wrong, actually agreeing to fight another guy is a whole lot scarier than going to the local arcade, even if one time a grown man threatens to actually hit you for throwing him while he's in Gar's block stun. But the way you get the confidence to do it is similar. You identify the skills you need to work on, you break them down so that they're manageable, and you try to get a little bit better in every single training session. You know that you can get better at basically anything you set your mind to. And that is a lesson that stays with you. And the thing is, I don't really play fighting games anymore because there's other stuff in my life that's taken their place now. But this stuff is an ongoing process, and it's kind of a flywheel effect, because every time you learn something new, it reinforces your own self-belief that you can learn things and you can grow as a person. And that effect will get stronger and stronger every time you do it. But you have to start somewhere. So why not start with fighting games? And if you want to learn to get good at anything, one place that you can start is with this video. Thanks very much for watching.